What you think about a queen may be wrong. We often imagine power beginning with a gilded throne, with radiant ceremonies, with the sound of brass trumpets echoing beneath cathedral domes. But sometimes, power begins very quietly, from a room that is not a bedroom, but a dining room, simply because hot water could be carried there more easily from the kitchen. And that small, almost mundane practicality, like a faint ink mark on the page of history, would open an era lasting nearly a century, an era bearing the name of one woman, Victoria. Imagine London at the beginning of the 19th century. Fog drifts lightly like a thin veil over rooftops, the streets still damp with the breath of night, and the British monarchy, seemingly solid, stands before a silent uncertainty. The line of succession has become fragile. Within that fragility, on the morning of May 24th, 1819, pale sunlight slips through the tall windows of Kensington Palace, falling upon a corner of a dining room, scented with lavender and the moisture of early dawn. A soft cry is heard, not loud, not heralded by trumpets, but like a small stone dropped into a still lake, sending ripples outward, farther and farther. The child is named Alexandrina Victoria, bearing the name of Tsar Alexander I, as a gesture of diplomatic courtesy. At that moment, no one could be certain that this small being, with her rosy hands, would one day stand at the center of a world in transition. From horse-drawn carriages to railways, from candlelight to steam, from ancient courts to the urgent pulse of industry. But history does not always choose those already crowned. Sometimes it chooses an ordinary person, places them into the adversity of fate, allows time to test them, and then through something particular, enduring will, self-command, and the ability to turn private life into a moral symbol, that person becomes the pillar that keeps an entire empire from tilting. If you are listening to Deep Sleep of Power as Night Has Already Fallen, let this story move slowly, like breathing. And if you wish to journey with us through lives that have shaped entire eras, gently subscribe to the channel and stay, because each night we will open a page of history together, not with noise, but with listening. For soon after that dawn, within the stillness of the palace, a void will appear, a void left by a father, and the shadow of loss will begin to settle over Victoria's childhood, like London fog spreading across cold stone streets. When a life has barely managed its first cry, history sometimes quietly takes away something irreparable. No noise, no drama, just a door closing, and behind it, an emptiness. For Victoria, that emptiness bore the name Father. In January 1820, as a London winter laid a thick grey fog over every road, the Duke of Kent, Victoria's father, died of pneumonia when his daughter was not yet 8 months old. For a child, such a death cannot be remembered in clear images. But the body remembers, the heart remembers, and that young soul grew up alongside a wordless absence, like a room that was always colder than the rest of the palace. The young mother, a German woman unfamiliar with the English language and courtly customs, suddenly became a widow in a foreign land. She withdrew inward, fearful and dependent. In that fragility, Victoria had no shoulder to lean on, no father's hand to guide her earliest steps. What remained was a prolonged silence, and a child who learned to observe the world from behind a curtain. For adults, loss is memory. For children, loss is a foundation. The absence of a father was not merely sorrow, it became a vacuum of power within the soul. No one taught Victoria how to trust naturally. No one shielded her from probing eyes. And within that emptiness, Other hands stepped in, not to protect, but to control. Victoria grew up in a world where every act of care came with conditions. Every embrace had a purpose. Every lesson carried authority within it. Lacking a father's presence, she gradually developed a deeply human need, the search for protection. Yet paradoxically, that very need led her to realize early on that not all protection is safe. During the long nights of childhood, when the palace sank into sleep, Victoria would lie awake, listening for the smallest sounds. Footsteps fading along distant corridors, wind whistling through door cracks, the slow ticking of clocks. There, in the stillness, she learned how to be alone. Harsh but necessary lesson for someone who would one day stand alone at the summit of power. That early absence forged in Victoria a rare ability to observe people with deep intuition. She could see motives hidden behind smiles. She could feel coercion concealed beneath the language of affection. And though still very young, she understood, by instinct, that if she did not hold herself firmly, she would become a puppet in the hands of others. Years later, after she had become queen, Victoria was often criticized for her intense attachments to men who played guiding roles in her life. From an elderly prime minister, to an intellectually equal husband, to companions in her later years. Yet few recognized that all of this traced back to a child who had lost her father too early. A child endlessly searching for a stability she had never known. And from that first wound, a quiet paradox took shape. Victoria became fiercely devoted to self-command. She despised being controlled. She despised being ordered. She despised being seen as weak. The absence of her father did not break her. It made her vigilant. It taught her that power, if not held in one's own hands, will always be used against oneself. This was the first psychological seed of a resolute monarch, one who would never allow anyone to stand between herself and the destiny of the kingdom. If you are listening at this late hour, let the story slow down here. Some pains do not require analysis, only acknowledgement. And Victoria, in the silence of her childhood, quietly acknowledged that pain and transformed it into endurance. Yet before that emptiness had time to heal, an even colder structure was built around her. A system created in the name of protection, but in truth, a glass cage. And within that cage, Victoria's childhood would enter its most suffocating phase. What history would later call, in chillingly neutral terms, the Kensington system. There are prisons that need no iron bars, no locks, no guards. They are built from rules, from excessive care, and from a familiar whisper, "It's all for your own good." Victoria's childhood unfolded inside such a prison. History calls it by a name that sounds almost harmless, the Kensington system. But for a child growing up within it, it was a glass cage, transparent, tightly sealed, and so suffocating that no one outside could hear the sighs within. After her father's death, power in Victoria's life did not disappear. It changed hands, and those who held it were not a king, but an ambitious pair, her mother, a woman fearful of the world, and Sir John Conroy, a man who saw himself as the architect of the future of a queen, not yet crowned. The Kensington system was built upon a principle as simple as it was chilling. Victoria was never to be alone. Not for a minute, not for a moment. She was required to sleep in the same room as her mother. She was not allowed to go down the stairs unless someone held her hand. She was forbidden to play with other children. Every meeting was monitored. Every relationship is filtered through suspicion. On the surface, it was protection, but beneath it lay strategy. Sir John Conroy understood one thing clearly. If Victoria grew up without freedom, she would grow up with dependence. And a dependent queen would be a queen easily controlled. The Kensington system needed no whip. It used isolation. It required no violence. It relied on habit. Day after day, Victoria's childhood was compressed, like a young plant forced to grow in a pot too small. In the long corridors of Kensington Palace, where light rarely reached the cold stone floors, Victoria learned a lesson very early. The world is not always kind, and control, when dressed as love, is even harder to recognize. In her diary, many years later, she wrote brief lines, heavy as lead. "I had a miserable childhood. I never had a father." These words were not a complaint. They were testimony. Victoria's comfort did not come from people. It came from things that could not be commanded. She found gentleness in small wooden dolls, carefully sewing tiny dresses for them, as if creating a parallel world, one where every figure was obedient and free of schemes. She found absolute loyalty in her spaniel named Dash, with his soft coat and eyes that never scrutinized. With Dash, Victoria was not an heir, not a political instrument, just a child. And within that isolation, a paradox quietly emerged. The Kensington system, designed to break the will, unintentionally forged in Victoria a rare capacity, silent resistance. No shouting, no rebellion, only observation, memory, and waiting. Victoria learned to read tones of voice, to distinguish genuine care from coercion, to remain silent, not out of fear, but because the time had not yet come. Every rule became a lesson in reverse. Every limitation became an outline, helping her understand clearly who she did not wish to become. If you are listening to this story late at night, notice this. Those who are controlled the longest often do not collapse. They accumulate. They grow quietly within. And when the door finally opens, they step out not as victims, but as those who are prepared. Victoria did not know precisely when she would escape that glass cage, but she knew one thing with certainty. If that day came, she would never allow anyone to imprison her again. And then, amid those suffocating days, a small moment, almost accidental, occurred. Not a rebellion, not a declaration, just a history lesson, a sheet of paper, and a name placed very close to the throne. In that moment, for the first time, Victoria saw her destiny written in black ink, and in the quiet of the schoolroom, a promise, light as breath, was made. A promise that would become the foundation of an entire era. But that is the story of the next part. There are moments in a human life that arrive without noise, without bells or applause to mark them. They come very softly, like a touch of awareness, and they stay for a long time. For Victoria, such a moment came when she was only 11 years old, during what seemed like an ordinary history lesson, inside the quiet schoolroom of Kensington Palace. The London light that day was pale and even, not radiant, not gloomy, just enough to make the black lines on the succession chart clearly visible. The tutor placed the paper on the table, explaining in an even voice the names, the arrows, the distances between generations of kings. And then, very near the top of that chart, Victoria saw her own name. Not at the center, but close enough to understand. There was no sharp intake of breath, no panicked fear, no impulsive joy, only a profound stillness. Victoria understood, not with the reasoning of an adult, but with the intuition of a child who had learned early how to observe. That her life might no longer belong to her alone, that the glass cage of her childhood might only have been the beginning, that ahead of her, if destiny called her name, lay a weight no one else could carry in her place. And in that moment, she spoke a very short sentence. Not a proclamation, not an oath made before witnesses, just words spoken to herself. I will be good. Read back later, the sentence seems almost disarmingly simple, yet history does not measure promises by eloquence, but by endurance. Good, for Victoria, did not mean gentle. It did not mean compliant. It did not mean pleasing everyone in order to be loved. Good meant right. Right in responsibility, right in discipline, right in the belief that power can stand only when it is entrusted, not imposed. That promise was recorded in her diary, written in careful handwriting, amid the steady ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece. Those silent pages could not know that decades later, an entire century would bear their imprint. But Victoria knew, at the level of a child forced to mature too soon, that if she were to become queen, she would not allow the throne to become a wall separating her from humanity. From this moment onward, power in Victoria's thinking began to change shape. It was no longer the abstract power of bloodline, nor divine authority. It became a moral commitment, and once made, such a commitment could not be withdrawn. If you are listening to this story as night has fallen, let the rhythm slow a little. The most important promises in life are often spoken when everything is quiet. No witnesses, no applause, only conscience standing there, silently taking note. From that day on, Victoria studied with a different attitude, not to impress, not to prove anything, but to be worthy. Every language lesson, every map, every concept of law or history was received as a necessary stone for a bridge between power and responsibility. She understood that if one day she stood at the summit, what would keep her from falling would not be a crown, but quiet preparation. The promise, I will be good, also carried within it a quiet paradox. It did not promise happiness. It did not promise freedom from suffering. It promised only not to turn away. And for that reason it was strong enough to guide a life that would last more than 60 years upon the throne. A life filled with upheaval, loss, glory, and solitude. Many years later, when Victoria was already queen, people would notice something rare in her: consistency. Not always beloved, not always correctly understood, but always guided by a moral axis, one that began in that history lesson at the age of 11. History is often written by battles, but sometimes history changes course through a whispered promise. Guided by that promise, Victoria stepped into the years that followed, not as a captive child, but as someone preparing for freedom. Ahead lay days of rigorous study, mornings filled with books, maps, and ideas about a world in motion. For before history would knock on her bedroom door one misty morning, Victoria needed to be equipped, not only with knowledge, but with inner steadiness. And that will be the story of the next part. There are forms of power built by shouted commands, and there are forms of power built by the prolonged silence of study. After the whispered promise at the age of 11, I will be good, Victoria did not enter adolescence with romantic fantasies. She entered it with discipline, not discipline imposed from outside, but self-discipline, the kind that forms when a person understands that if destiny calls their name, preparation is the only way not to betray the promise made to oneself. Mornings at Kensington Palace began very early. London light, thin as mist, slipped through the curtains and fell upon the wooden desk, where a quill pen already lay in waiting. There was no clamor of courtiers, no ceremony, only the steady sound of learning, a slow rhythm, gentle enough to open the mind without exhausting the heart. Victoria studied languages first, French to understand diplomacy, German to reconnect with her family's roots, Italian for culture, Latin to reach the core of European law and history. Each language was not merely a tool of communication, but a way of seeing the world. She learned that power does not speak a single tongue. It changes its voice according to context, culture, and human nature. Then came maps. On wide sheets of paper, she moved her fingers slowly, from the small islands of the British Isles, across open seas, to distant lands, India, Australia, Africa. She did not see maps as games of color. She saw them as a system, sea routes, ports, resources, and the people living under different latitudes. She understood that an empire cannot survive on will alone. It requires connection. In lessons on economics, Victoria touched the heart of the age. Steam engines in Manchester, shipyards in Liverpool, tall chimneys exhaling smoke in steady pulses, like the breathing of a new world. She learned that Britain's strength lay not only in its army, but in productive capacity, in trade, in the ability to turn innovation into infrastructure. This was no longer the age of sword and shield. It was the age of industry and organization. Alongside this came constitutional law, dry texts, yet essential. Victoria learned how power was distributed, how Parliament functioned, and how decisions were restrained so as not to exceed their bounds. She understood very early that a modern queen could not rule by command alone, but by delicate balance between authority and consent, between tradition and change, between the individual and the institution. What is striking is this: no one forced Victoria to study so much. This was not a display of training. It was quiet preparation, like a gardener tending the roots before hoping for blossoms. She read not to display knowledge. She took notes not to earn praise. She studied to stand firm in a world she knew would show no mercy. If you are listening deep into the night, notice this feeling. There is knowledge that does not excite us immediately, but instead gives us peace. Victoria's learning belonged to this kind. It was not loud. It accumulated, and when needed, it appeared like solid ground beneath one's feet. It was during this period that Victoria's philosophy of governance gradually took shape. She saw power not as a reward of bloodline, but as a full-time responsibility, a task requiring preparation, discipline, and accountability for long-term consequences. She understood that if she wished to keep her promise to be good, that goodness had to be carried out through understanding, not emotion. Perhaps for this reason, Victoria grew up with an unusual maturity, unhurried, unimpulsive. She did not allow the confinement of her childhood to turn into recklessness in youth. She learned how to wait, a crucial skill for someone who would one day make decisions under the gaze of all. And then, when the lessons ended, when the quill was set down, when the maps were rolled away, history, never one to announce itself, prepared to knock at the door. Not with thunder, not with a grand ceremony, but with a misty morning, when a young girl would awaken and realize that what she had prepared for over many years was about to be tested. For there are moments in life when all quiet preparation converges, and that moment was drawing very near. In the next part, we will step into the moment of transition, when a princess closes the chapter of youth, and a queen opens the first page of power. There are moments in history that require no trumpets to become great. They arrive very early, when the city is still asleep, when mist still lies upon stone steps, and when a person has not yet fully awakened from their dreams. The morning of June 20th, 1837, began in just such a way. London lay under a grey haze. The air was damp and cold, carrying the lingering scent of night. In a small room at Kensington Palace, Victoria, then only 18 years old, was sleeping peacefully, unaware that her life had reached the final threshold of preparation. Years of quiet study, self-imposed discipline, and whispered promises were all waiting for a single moment to become reality. At around 6 o'clock in the morning, a knock sounded at the door, not urgent, not hurried, but firm enough to interrupt sleep. When Victoria stepped forward to receive the visitors, she wore only a simple cotton nightgown, her hair falling naturally to her shoulders. No crown, no jewels, just a human being, standing bare before destiny. Before her stood the Archbishop of Canterbury and Lord Conyngham. They knelt, slowly, solemnly, decisively, and in that moment, the words spoken changed everything. King William IV had died. Victoria was no longer a princess. She was Queen of the British Empire. There was no scream, no tears, only a deep silence, the kind that appears when one understands there is no turning back. History often portrays ascensions in radiant imagery, yet the actual moment of power is usually stark in its simplicity. Victoria stood listening, and in that stillness, she felt clearly the weight of her long-ago promise. No one repeated the words, "I will be good," but they were present, like an invisible axis holding her upright. Victoria's first act as queen was not the issuing of a decree, not the summoning of courtiers. It was a small, deeply human request. "I wish to be alone for an hour." This was not a weakness. It was her first act of self-command. In that quiet room, Victoria was alone, truly alone, for the first time in her life. No supervisors, no controlling gazes, no whisper of the Kensington system behind her. She took a long breath, and in that breath, an old era came to a close. Soon after, she made a decision of profound symbolic weight. She moved her bed out of her mother's room. The act may have seemed private, even trivial, but to those who understand power, it carried significant meaning. It was a declaration made without speech. Manipulation had ended. The glass cage of childhood was dismantled, not by force but by choice. If you are listening late into the night, allow your heartbeat to slow, for some transitions are quiet, yet they reshape an entire person. Victoria did not step onto the throne as an impulsive girl. She stepped onto it as someone prepared, not perfect, but steady. The first hours of the new reign unfolded in a curious atmosphere. The court observed. The press waited. Politicians measured her closely. They wondered, could this young woman carry an empire? Yet Victoria's composure, her calmness, her attentiveness, her refusal to rush, answered more convincingly than any defense. Power in her hands did not erupt. It settled, and for that very reason, it became trustworthy. Victoria understood that from this moment on, every gesture carried meaning. Every silence would be interpreted. Every decision would have consequences extending beyond a single lifetime. And rather than striving to prove herself, she chose to stand firm, like a new pillar, still rough at the edges, yet unshakable. That moment of transition closed the chapter on a controlled childhood and opened a new chapter of personal authority. But Victoria also knew that power, newly gained, still required guidance. No one rules alone, especially in a world moving faster than ever before. And then amid the uncertain early days of her reign, she found a familiar presence. A man older, composed, carrying experience and a warmth that felt very much like the father she had never known. In the next part, we will enter that special relationship, the bond between a young queen and her first advisor, where power begins to learn how to be guided. Some people enter our lives not to seize power, but to help us carry it. After that misty morning of 1837, when Victoria awoke and suddenly became queen, the atmosphere within Kensington Palace seemed to shift. The old corridors were still long, the stone steps still cold. Yet within the heart of the 18-year-old girl, something had changed. She was no longer the one being led. She was the one who had to lead. Even so, even the strongest among us needs a point of support. Not something to lean on forever, but something to steady the first steps, when one's feet are not yet accustomed to the height of power. And that support, in the early days of the reign, bore the name Lord Melbourne. He did not arrive like a general, nor like a thunderous orator pounding the table. Melbourne came with the calm of a man who had lived through enough turbulence to know that power does not need to speak loudly. He spoke slowly, he listened often, and he possessed something Victoria had never known: the presence of a father, not imposing, not locking doors, not using affection as a pretext for control. For Victoria, this was an experience so new it was almost overwhelming. She had grown up inside a glass cage, where every lesson carried its own set of restraints. Melbourne taught her differently, through respect. He did not demand that she behave. He helped her understand. It is said that during that period, Melbourne spent many hours each day at the side of the young queen. Their meetings did not resemble formal councils. They were more like long, warm conversations where politics was presented as a river, not something to fear, but something to learn how to swim within. Melbourne showed Victoria how to read colonial reports, pages of dense coal dust words, within which lay the breathing rhythm of an entire empire. He guided her to view problems not through immediate reaction, but through layers of consequence. He told her that a hasty answer could shake Parliament, while a well-timed silence could avert a crisis. And more important than all else, he taught her an art known only to the experienced, the art of not being swept away by emotion. Victoria, though intelligent, was still a young woman. She carried the sensitivity of someone deprived of familial warmth and the pride of one who had only just reclaimed autonomy after 18 years of control. Power exhilarated her, but it also made her vulnerable. Melbourne, with a gentleness shaped by discipline, became an invisible railing beside her staircase, not pulling her down, yet not allowing her to fall. In the rare pauses from affairs of state, they rode horses together, spoke of Shakespeare's plays, of French history, of the customs of European courts. For Victoria, these conversations felt like stepping out of a sealed room and breathing a wider air for the first time. Not the air of complete freedom, but the air of maturity. If you're listening late into the night, try to imagine those sounds: the fading rhythm of hooves along a path, the wind brushing softly across the grass, and the voice of an older man, slow, patient, as though speaking to a child who has just awakened from a long dream. For those advanced in years, the feeling is deeply familiar. We, too, once had to relearn how to stand steady after life suddenly changed. Melbourne understood Victoria in a profoundly human way. He knew she was not only queen, but also a soul shaped by isolation. And in that understanding, he created a space of safety for her, not to shield her from reality, but to give her the calm required to face it. Yet every safe harbor comes with a cost. Their closeness unsettled many at court. A young queen spending so much time with her prime minister. This, to others, looked like dependence. And it is true that in her early years, Victoria sometimes leaned on Melbourne, as one leans on a support column, solid, reliable, yet capable of making one forget that a column is not the house itself. For this reason, the relationship was both a gift and a test. It helped Victoria stabilize the throne at its most fragile moment. But it also posed a quiet question. When Melbourne was no longer there, who would she be? Such is the law of maturity. One day the guide must step back so that the guided may walk alone. Melbourne, gentle though he was, remained a statesman. He knew this attachment could not last forever. He also knew that a lasting reign must rest on the Queen's own inner strength, not on any shadow, however beloved. For Victoria, Melbourne was the first to prove that power could be exercised with softness, without threats, without punishment, only with the right rhythm, the proper distance, the right moment. He helped her believe in a new form of power, one grounded in public trust, not solely in bloodline. And as that trust began to take shape, history prepared to offer Victoria a larger stage, a moment when all of London would look at her no longer as a young girl, but as the symbol of an era. For under Melbourne's quiet guidance, Victoria was gradually readying herself for the ritual that would seal everything, the coronation. In the next part, we will step into the day when cannon fire echoed, Westminster Abbey glowed with incense and stained glass, and a heavy crown was placed upon a youthful head. But before the crown touched her hair, remember this: there was someone who helped Victoria learn how to carry that weight without losing herself. There are days when a city does more than wake up. It changes its rhythm of breath. On the morning of June 28, 1838, London opened its eyes to the long peal of bells and the distant echo of cannon fire. Stone streets, still damp with night mist, seemed brighter than usual. Flags were hung from windows. Crowds gathered not out of passing curiosity, but from the sense that something larger than themselves was taking place. Not a war, not a treaty, but a collective promise. That order could be renewed without rupture. Into this scene, Victoria stepped into the light of history. The gilded carriage rolled slowly, as if aware that speed no longer mattered. Inside, the young queen sat upright, her gaze calm, her breathing steady. She was no longer the girl who had only just relied on the counsel of a guide, nor was she yet the untouchable symbol of an empire. She stood in between, the place where a human being must stand on her own feet before the crown touches her hair. Outside, cheers rose and fell like waves. Inside, the scent of incense mingled with light filtered through stained glass, creating an atmosphere almost unreal, unhurried, unforced. Thousands of eyes were fixed upon her, yet Victoria did not rush to meet any gaze. She held her own rhythm. She understood that power, if it is to endure, must move with composure. The ceremony was long. There were moments of awkwardness. There were heavy details, especially the crown, so weighty it strained the neck. Yet Victoria showed no sign of discomfort. She did not display strength. She endured quietly as a first, silent test of the years ahead. When the crown was placed upon her head, it was not the gleam of gold that dazzled the moment, but a spreading calm. A young woman had stood steady within an ancient rite, without losing herself. That was what the public felt. And they believed. They believed not because the ceremony was flawless, but because they sensed in Victoria a rare authenticity. No arrogance, no panic, no haste to prove herself. They believed because, after years of doubt about the monarchy, they were witnessing a different form of power that knew how to restrain itself. If you are listening in the quiet of the night, notice this feeling. There are collective moments that require no explanation. They work like a pillow placed just right. Once the head touches, the breath slows. The coronation of that year had such an effect on Britain. It did not shout that a new era has arrived. It whispered, and for that reason, the whisper carried far. Within the flow of ritual, Victoria did not stand alone. She carried with her the years of control that had taught her patience, the promise to be a good person that had become discipline, the quiet lessons of governance that had crystallized into posture. The coronation did not create a queen. It confirmed what had long been prepared. And that confirmation had consequences. Soon after the ceremony, public trust was strengthened. The press softened its tone. Doubts briefly receded, not because all problems vanished, but because a stable center had emerged. In a century moving at great speed, machines, cities, commerce, people needed a moral anchor. Victoria, through her calm presence, became that anchor. Yet power, once bestowed, also demands another form. From this moment on, every private decision would carry public resonance. Every personal heartbeat would be read as a signal of the nation. Victoria understood this, and perhaps for that reason, even amid the brilliance of the coronation, her heart retained a space, not of lack, but of openness. A lasting reign cannot rest on ritual alone. It requires a counterbalance, a mind alongside one's own, a hand to share the weight. The coronation placed the crown upon a young head, but for that crown not to become a solitary burden, Victoria would need someone who understood that power, too, must be loved, if it is not to harden. As the cannon fire faded, as the crowds dispersed into smaller streets, and as the city returned to its ordinary rhythm, Victoria turned inward, not to rest, but to begin. The coronation marked the threshold of a new era. The years that followed would test what that era would be nourished by. And very soon, within familiar corridors, destiny would bring an encounter, quiet, unspectacular, yet powerful enough to shift the axis of the Queen's private life and political world. An encounter where affection and responsibility would meet for the first time, opening the next chapter of power, the chapter of partnership. But that is the story of the next part. There are meetings that do not change the world at once, but they change the axis of a single life. And from that axis, the world gradually begins to tilt. After the coronation, Victoria entered the early days of power with a new composure. The palace grew busier, schedules tighter, the public gaze sharper. Yet within that steady machinery, there remained a quiet space, the still undefined space of private life. Power was now hers. Public trust was taking shape. Only one thing had yet to arrive: an intellectual counterweight, a presence close enough to share the weight of the crown. That space was filled in October 1839 at Windsor Castle. The autumn air was gentle. Thin sunlight rested upon expansive lawns, where footsteps sounded light, almost like greetings. When Prince Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha entered that setting, there was no ostentatious ceremony, no trumpets, just a family meeting, and for that very reason, authentic. Yet from the first moment, Victoria sensed something unusual, not exhilaration but compatibility. She recorded in her diary, briefly without embellishment, that Albert had intelligent blue eyes, a calm manner, and a seriousness that made those around him feel at ease. This was not the brilliance of one seeking conquest, but the steadiness of someone who knew where he stood. For Victoria, raised under control and only recently reclaimed in self-command, that steadiness held a particular appeal. They talked, not in compliments but in ideas. Albert spoke of science, of education, of organizational discipline. Victoria listened, not as a queen receiving an audience, but as a person discovering a shared conversational rhythm. In Albert, she saw something rare, intellect without imposition. And in Victoria, Albert recognized another kind of strength, a will forged by isolation, now seeking a path toward cooperation. The meeting unfolded without haste. No one needed to prove anything. No one sought to dominate. For that reason, it went deep. There is an important and very human detail in this story. Victoria was the one who proposed. The Constitution required it, but the choice also reflected her character. In a world where women were expected to wait, Victoria acted. She did not see a proposal as a diminishment of power. She saw it as a governing decision, choosing the right partner for a long journey. On October 15th, in a private room at Windsor, the proposal was spoken, not as ritual, but as affirmation, that power, if it is to endure, must be shared, and sharing does not weaken power. On the contrary, it makes it more precise. If you are listening in the night, notice this feeling. Some relationships do not quicken the heartbeat, but steady its rhythm. Albert came to Victoria in this way. He did not replace the guides who came before. He complemented them. He did not overshadow her authority. He gave it structure through which it could operate effectively. This union carried explicit calculation and deep humanity as well. Victoria brought legitimacy, public connection, and an instinct for power. Albert brought discipline, systems, and the scientific vision of a rising century. Together they formed a governing partnership rarely seen in Europe. Not king and queen by hierarchy, but partners. The encounter at Windsor, therefore, was not merely a romantic story. It was a strategic decision, quiet, unshowy, laying the groundwork for how the Victorian era would function. Power bound to family, politics bound to morality, innovation bound to discipline. But every alliance, to be recognized, requires a shared ritual, a cultural marker by which society can look and understand that a new standard is being set. And very soon, that union would be realized through a wedding, one that would not only join two people, but also shape the aesthetics and values of an entire age. In the next part, we will enter the day when the color white, simple, pure, quietly, changed how the world imagined marriage. And from there, power would learn how to live within everyday life, not only upon a throne. There are revolutions that need no banners. They begin with a tranquil choice, like choosing a color on a winter morning when the world is holding its breath to see what will change. On February 10th, 1840, London awoke to a gentle cold, not the kind that cuts the skin, but the kind that sharpens awareness. Along the streets leading to the Chapel Royal, crowds gathered not out of fleeting curiosity, but from a shared intuition that today they would witness an unusual ritual, not loud, not ostentatious, yet powerful enough to reshape how people thought about power, family, and private life. Victoria entered her wedding day not as a queen preparing to display authority. She entered it as a woman who had carefully weighed what must be preserved and what should be changed. And the most surprising decision, so unexpected it was initially seen as a breach of convention, was the white wedding dress. In an age when royalty favored robes of silver and gold, densely embroidered with symbols of power, Victoria's white appeared as a pause. Not white to display wealth, but white to clarify the human form. The pure white satin gown, edged with delicate Honiton lace, did not overpower its wearer. It supported her. It allowed Victoria to appear not as a distant symbol, but as a human being choosing family life in full view of the public. This choice was not accidental. It was a message that power could stand beside life rather than above it, that a royal marriage was not merely a political arrangement, but a publicly affirmed moral standard offered for society to observe and learn from. Inside the chapel, light filtered through stained glass, resting gently on the faces of two people standing together, neither above the other, neither eclipsing the other. Albert, in his simple ceremonial attire, did not seek the spotlight. He stood as a partner, at the right place, at the proper distance. Victoria, composed, neither trembling nor hurried, carried with her all the years of preparation as she stepped into a new role, both queen and wife. If you are listening in the night, notice this rhythm. There are moments when power learns how to be still. The wedding that day did not need a display to persuade. It persuaded through consistency between promise, choice, and action. When Victoria placed the orange blossom wreath upon her head, a symbol of purity and fertility, she did something that seemed small, yet carried far-reaching influence. From that moment on, millions of weddings around the world would choose white as their standard, not because royalty commanded it, but because royalty set an example. Yet this wedding changed more than aesthetics. It redefined the role of royalty within a rapidly industrializing society. Victoria did not turn her great day into a spectacle of excess. She turned it into a public lesson in commitment, fidelity, and emotional discipline, values a swiftly urbanizing society urgently needed in order not to lose itself. Immediately after the wedding, the palace ceased to be merely a place for banquets. It began to resemble a central office where decisions were made, papers processed, and family became the core of governance. Victoria did not separate private life from power. She wove them together deliberately. Family, in her reign, was not a private matter to conceal, but a standard by which society could measure itself. From that moment, Albert was not only a husband, he became the bearer of discipline and structure within power, not overshadowing, not usurping, but supporting, by asking questions, organizing processes, and introducing science into administration. The wedding thus became the point of departure for a new governing model, two people working side by side, rather than one in front and one behind. If you look closely, the most subtle element of that wedding lies not in the ritual, but in the rhythm, unhurried, unextended, everything unfolded in proper measure, just as Victoria always chose. And it was precisely this rhythm that led society to believe that an era could be renewed without tearing down what already stood firm. As the chapel bells faded, as the crowds dispersed, and as white gradually gave way to everyday life, Victoria and Albert turned inward, not to rest, but to begin their work. For a wedding is only a promise. Governance is the fulfillment of that promise day after day, through small but consistent decisions. In the next part, we will enter the shared workspace, where two desks are placed side by side, where ink and paper become the background music, and where power learns to operate through cooperation. There, the Victorian era will reveal its true nature. Not loud, not autocratic, but enduring. like a good habit repeated each day. There are forms of power that require no speeches. They are built from habit, from the steady rhythm of days repeated, and from two desks placed side by side, close enough to share the light, far enough for each person to keep their own space of thought. After the wedding, the palace gradually changed its tempo. Fewer banquets, longer working hours, and at the center of that shift stood a single room, not dazzling, not ostentatious, where two wooden desks were set in parallel. There, ink and paper became the background music. There, power learned how to go to work every day. Victoria sat upright, reading slowly. Albert sat beside her, taking concise notes. No one stood above the other. No one intruded upon the other's mental space. Two desks, two rhythms of breath, one shared purpose. This was not a blending of roles. It was a subtle division of labor. Victoria carried instinct for power, public sensibility, and the weight of legitimacy. Albert carried discipline, systems, and the ability to turn ideas into processes. In the mornings, colonial reports arrived thick as mist. News from ports, factories, and railways. Dry figures lined up, waiting to be understood correctly. Victoria read to feel the nation's pulse, the public's expectations, the risks embedded in each decision. Albert read to clarify, underlining, organizing, asking questions, tracing connections. One held the moral axis, the other had the operational axis. Power, therefore, did not slip. If you are listening late at night, notice something very familiar. There are days when we work best not in moments of excitement, but in steadiness. The Victorian reign functioned in that way. No explosions, no impulsiveness, just small decisions, made at the right time, repeated long enough to become reliable. Albert did not seek to stand in front. He understood that Victoria's authority flowed from public trust, something that cannot be borrowed. Instead of taking the spotlight, he built the framework. He standardized how information was received. He introduced science into governance, measurement, testing, improvement. He believed that an industrial empire could not be run on inspiration alone, but on systems. Victoria, across the desk, learned how not to rush. She had grown up under control, longed for autonomy, and entered power with caution. Now she learned another difficult lesson. For power to endure, it sometimes requires listening to complex questions, even when they slow decisions. And she accepted this not from weakness, but from maturity. There were exhausting days, there were tense days, especially as Victoria became pregnant, and then pregnant again. The body changed, emotions shifted, but the two desks remained. Ink dried steadily on paper. Albert filled gaps when needed. Victoria held the overall rhythm when needed. Quiet co-rule did not erase differences. It used differences in the right places. In that room, decisions affecting millions were made in low voices. No need to raise them, no need to strike the table, for when processes are transparent, voices can be soft. And that softness made power less frightening, something essential in a century of machines and rapid urbanization. From the outside, many saw only a queen signing decrees. Few saw the long hours before that, reading, marking, revising, weighing. Few saw Albert asking why, and Victoria answering because of people. Few saw the evenings when lamps stayed lit after the city had fallen asleep. Yet it was precisely that unseen part that produced the visible result. A stable reign amid a turbulent Europe. Look closely, and the two desks are not merely furniture. They are a declaration. That power does not require a single voice. That leadership can be coordination, not diluting responsibility, but making responsibility more precise. That in a complex world, the best answers often come from two ways of thinking, sitting down together. Of course, quiet. Co-rule also has its costs. It demands trust. It demands emotional discipline. It requires the ability to step back a pace, to keep the shared axis intact. Victoria and Albert accepted that cost, not with grand vows, but with work habits, day after day. And those habits extended beyond the room. They shaped how the monarchy appeared to the public, serious yet approachable, disciplined but not cold. They shaped how government handled crises, less noise, more preparation. They shaped how society viewed the royal family, not merely as symbols, but as an operating unit. As the two desks settled into routine, new sounds began to echo through the palace. Not the scratch of ink, but the laughter of children. The family grew, responsibilities expanded, and power once again learned how to live within life, not apart from it, not in retreat. In the next part, we will enter the royal nursery, where power is expressed not through decrees, but through upbringing, where children become threads, linking dynasties, and where a long, quiet strategy begins to shape the map of Europe. But remember this moment: two desks placed side by side, and a reign learning how to work in order to endure. There are centers of power not built from marble or steel. They are built from laughter, from small footsteps, and from mornings that begin earlier than the affairs of state. In Victoria's reign, such a center existed, not in council chambers, not in parliament, but in the royal nursery. After the two desks had found their shared rhythm, after power had learned to operate through cooperation, the palace began to echo with a new sound. Not the rustle of ink, not the footsteps of courtiers, but the voices of children. That sound did not interrupt power. It reshaped it in another way. Power now had a future. Victoria gave birth to 9 children. In the context of the 19th century, this number was not merely a family matter. It was a strategic declaration. Each child was not simply an heir, but a living connection. One day they would grow, travel, marry, and scatter soft threads across Europe. The empire, therefore, expanded not only by maps, but by genealogy. The royal nursery became a distinctive space. There, laughter blended with lessons. Geography stood beside language. Discipline stood beside play. Victoria was not always gentle in her maternal role. She candidly acknowledged her own complex feelings, but she was serious about upbringing. Serious not to control, but to prepare. Albert brought into the nursery a clearly German spirit: order, schedules, and comprehensive education. Children learned foreign languages early. They studied history not merely as a sequence of events, but as lessons in consequence. They knew science to understand a changing world. Victoria, alongside him, held a different role. She set the example. Example in daily routine. Example in dedication. An example of placing the family at the center without weakening national responsibility. If you are listening at night, notice this familiar feeling. There are families whose rhythm softens an entire home. The royal nursery had such an effect on the palace, and beyond it, on society. For in a century of rapid urbanization, when the tempo of machines pushed people faster than their emotions could follow, the image of a gathered family became a moral anchor. From that nursery, a tradition was born, light as falling snow. Yet it traveled far, the Christmas tree. Albert brought the custom from Germany. Victoria turned it into a symbol. The tree, candlelight, modest gifts, nothing extravagant, entered households across the empire. No decree was needed, no campaign required, only example, and society followed. But the royal nursery was more than a cultural seedbed. It was a long-term diplomatic chessboard. As the children grew and married into Europe's royal houses, Germany, Russia, Spain, Victoria became the grandmother of Europe. The title was not merely affectionate, it was effective. Kinship created soft channels of dialogue, helping to reduce conflict on a continent long prone to upheaval. Here, power learned how to live within everyday life, not through commands, but through household practice, not through threats, but through familiarity. An empire can inspire fear. A family inspires trust. Victoria understood this, and she placed family where it belonged, not to obscure politics, but to humanize it. There were afternoons when, after work concluded, Victoria returned to the nursery, not as a queen, but as a mother. Such moments are not fully recorded in history books, yet they left lasting traces in how society viewed the monarchy, in how working people thought about family, in how work ethic traveled from home to factory. Of course, every center carries pressure. Raising 9 children was no small task. Each temperament was a challenge. Each educational choice is a gamble. But Victoria and Albert did not seek perfection. They sought consistency. Consistency in discipline, consistency in affection, consistency in purpose, preparing for the future. And that future was not only a series of marriages, it was an industrial world in eruption. As the children grew within the royal nursery, outside, chimneys rose, railways stretched, the steamships cut through waves. The family, the soft center, had prepared the empire, the hard center, to step into a phase of visible strength. If you have listened this far, let the rhythm slow, for there are powers that do not proclaim themselves. They accumulate in silence, just as a family creates endurance for an entire society. And when that endurance had grown sufficient, the vision of Victoria's reign began to extend beyond the nursery door. From the warmth of family life, the gaze turned toward glass roofs and iron structures, where Britain would present itself to the world through science, industry, and faith in progress. In the next part, we will step into the Crystal Palace, a transparent emblem of the age, where the future was displayed as a promise, and where the empire learned how to see itself in the light of invention. But before leaving the nursery, remember this: there was a center that kept the empire standing, through life growing day by day. There are moments when a nation does not need to speak much to be understood. It only needs to open its doors and let the light pour in. By the middle of the 19th century, Britain stood at a curious crossroads. The royal family had become a moral standard. Power had learned to operate through discipline and cooperation. Yet beyond the palace walls, the world was moving faster than ever, driven by steam, by iron, by new ideas demanding to be seen. The Victorian era had reached a moment that required boldness to present the future, and they chose to do so through transparency. In 1851 in Hyde Park, a structure rose that seemed to defy every palace that had come before it. No heavy stone, no sealed walls, no low ceilings. Instead, glass and iron, light, tall, and luminous. It was called the Crystal Palace. The name alone suggested a new idea. Power need not hide, progress need not dwell in shadow. Beneath that glass roof, the great exhibition opened its doors. Thousands of inventions were carefully arranged. From steam engines and looms to new materials and finely crafted objects from across the world. The sound of footsteps, the low murmur of wonder, the gentle hum of machinery, all merged into a single composition of confidence. Victoria went there almost every day. She walked slowly through the galleries, her eyes not seeking spectacle, but order. Here, she saw what Albert had long believed, that science and industry, if properly organized, could sustain human life. She did not view machines as crude symbols of power. She saw them as instruments of stability, reducing poverty, expanding trade, connecting society. If you are listening at night, notice this feeling. There are places that make us feel at ease because everything is set in its proper place. The Crystal Palace created that feeling, not through opulence but through clarity. Transparent, so nothing was hidden. Tall, so nothing was constrained. Wide, so everything could be received. The Great Exhibition was not merely an event. It was a manifesto of the age. Britain did not simply claim strength. Britain demonstrated it by inviting the world to see, to touch, and to compare. No slogans were needed, no challenges issued. Capability was displayed and allowed to speak for itself. Here, power took on another form, the power of standards. When your products, processes, and infrastructure become the benchmark, coercion is unnecessary. Others will adjust themselves. Victoria understood this, and she supported the vision not for prestige, but for the durability it brought to society. In the reflections of glass, the future appeared as a space one could enter, neither frightening nor chaotic. That was what distinguished the Great Exhibition from earlier displays of power. It reassured. It suggested that progress could be managed, that change need not destroy what already stood firm. And within that reassurance, Britain saw itself anew, not only as an empire, but as an organizing center of the world. Trade, science, and standardization began to weave an expansive network. The Crystal Palace, therefore, did not merely display objects. It displayed a way of thinking. If the royal family represented the soft center of power, then the Crystal Palace was the hard center, where ideas were framed, where progress was measured. The two centers complemented one another. One cultivated morality, the other deployed capability, and between them, the Victorian era found its balanced rhythm. When the Great Exhibition closed, the transparent structure did not fade from memory. It left behind a new habit, the habit of making progress public. From then on, the world grew accustomed to comparison, standardization, and mutual learning. A slow but enduring era of globalization began. But every light casts a shadow. As the glass reflected, it also revealed distant lands being connected, not only by trade, but by power. From beneath that transparent roof, the gaze of empire stretched farther, toward vast swathes of color on the map. In the next part, we will leave the bright space of the Crystal Palace and turn to the red map, where the empire spread, where the sun was said to never set, and where questions of responsibility began to walk alongside strength. But before leaving the light of glass, remember this. There was a moment when the future was put on display, and the world believed it could be governed by reason. There are maps that do more than show directions. They tell a story about power. After the transparent light of the Crystal Palace, after the murmurs of wonder beneath its glass roof, Britain began to see itself as a center of the world, not through pure pride, but through an efficient sense. Networks. The Victorian era was not only the age of machines, it was the age of invisible threads binding continents together by steamships, railways, and telegraph cables running beneath the seas. If you have ever looked at a 19th century map, One thing stands out immediately: the color red. That red spread slowly yet relentlessly, like ink seeping into paper. It was called the empire on which the sun never sets. A phrase that sounds poetic, but beneath it lay a strict operational logic. When night fell in London, the sun still shone on India. When fog covered the Thames, light still reached Australia. And when darkness settled over one colony, dawn had already arrived in another. The empire did not sleep because the system could not afford to rest. In the palace offices, reports from every corner arrived with the regularity of a heartbeat. Figures on taxation, on cargo, on ships docking in port, lines of text on resources, gold mines in Australia, tea plantations in Ceylon, yields of cotton, sugar, and spices. Power, in this era, was not only military, it was flow. The flow of materials, of labor, of information. Victoria paid close attention to these flows, not because she wished to control every detail, but because she understood one fundamental truth. A great empire does not collapse when enemies strike its gates. It collapses when connections break, when information arrives too late, when decisions fall into chaos. From a distance, the empire looks like an expansion, but look closely, and you will see something else. Administration. Infrastructure was built. Ports were expanded. Railways cut through lands that had once known only footpaths. Telegraph cables stretched across oceans, shrinking the world, where information traveled faster and power traveled with it. If you are listening at night, notice this feeling. There are systems that inspire both admiration and a quiet chill because they are too efficient. The British Empire under Victoria was such a system. It connected the world more tightly, yet at the same time raised profound questions about who benefited, who bore the cost, and who had the authority to define progress. In your outline, there is an important detail that must retain the DSP tone. Victoria believed the empire carried a civilizing mission: education, medicine, and order. This belief was widespread in her time, and it helps us understand her psychology of power. She did not think of herself as merely occupying. She believed she was responsible. But history always has two sides. One hand builds infrastructure. The other holds decision-making power. When railways are laid, who chooses the routes? When laws are introduced, who writes them? When trade expands, who retains the profits? These questions need not be answered with accusation. DSP is strongest when it allows the questions to remain, like glowing embers lingering through the night. During this period, control over distant territories was not always smooth. There were tensions, uprisings, and events that forced the palace to confront the darker side of the very network it governed. And especially after the upheaval in India in 1857, imperial power entered a new phase, more centralized, more administrative, and heavier in burden. Victoria, with her deep respect for order, saw these disturbances as signs that governance must be tighter, connections firmer, and royal morality more transparent. She became a symbol of stability, not only for Britain, but for the broader idea that the world itself could be managed through order. Yet just as the empire reached the height of its confidence, Victoria's private life began to prepare for a fall, not from the throne, but into a deeper place. Grief. For power, however vast its reach across maps, cannot protect a human being from loss. It can command ships. It can draw cables across oceans. It can color continents red. But it cannot prevent a room from becoming empty. And so, while we look at that red map as a symbol of strength, history will suddenly draw the curtain in another direction, toward morning. A year would come when Victoria no longer viewed the world with the confident eyes of empire, but with the eyes of a woman who had lost what mattered most. In the next part, we will enter the year of sorrow, 1861. A year when loss did not arrive just once. And from that moment on, the Victorian reign would enter a different chapter, power no longer operating through the bright light of progress, but through the darkness of loyalty and endurance. But before leaving the map, remember this: red is not only power, it is a network, and every network has its point of most excellent strain. There are years that need no cascade of dramatic events to become heavy. They require only one loss in the right place, and a person's entire world changes color. The year 1861 arrived for Victoria in just this way. No trumpets, no warning signs, only a sequence of days in which light slowly thinned. Footsteps in the palace grew hollow, and time, once governed by schedules, suddenly dragged forward with painful slowness. In March of that year, Victoria's mother died. Her passing carried with it a layer of complex emotion, not only sorrow, but regret. Years of distance, misunderstandings never fully resolved, words left unspoken, all settled like fine dust within the heart. For a queen accustomed to maintaining order, regret was something irreparable, and for that reason, it lingered. But the true blow, the one that shattered the axis of life, came in December. Albert died at just 42 years of age. No preparation could have been sufficient for that moment. Albert was not only a husband, he was the rhythm of power, the structure of the working day, the intellectual counterweight that had kept Victoria steady for more than 2 decades. When he was gone, the room with 2 desks suddenly fell out of tempo, one desk empty, the other unsure by what rhythm to read the reports. Victoria murmured, almost in a whisper, "My life, which was so beautiful, has ended." This was not melodrama. It was emotional truth, the truth of someone who had built an entire life, public and private, upon the foundation of a shared companionship. When that foundation vanished, power did not collapse. It froze. From that day forward, Victoria wore black, not for weeks, but for 40 years. Black was not merely clothing. It became an institution, a moral code, a rhythm of living, a way of being. She withdrew from public view, not to evade responsibility, but because grief occupied the entirety of her inner space. In that withdrawal, she continued to sign documents, read reports, maintain order, but she no longer appeared as before. The palace climate changed. Albert's rooms were kept exactly as they were, as though time itself had been locked at a single hour. Each morning, servants still brought hot water and fresh towels, a silent, repeated ritual, like a refusal to accept reality. Not superstition, but loyalty taken to its furthest limit. If you are listening in the night, notice this feeling. There are losses that do not make us scream or weep. They make us move more slowly, speak more softly, and live by habit, because habit is the only thing that remains standing when meaning collapses. Victoria lived this way for the 4 decades that followed. Society reacted. Some felt compassion, others criticized. They said a queen could not remain withdrawn for so long. They told the monarchy that it required visibility, but history, looking back, would see something else. Victoria's grief redefined public morality. In an industrial age when everything moved quickly and was easily replaced, the image of a woman mourning for life established a new standard of loyalty and emotional endurance. From this point on, power assumed a different form. No longer the bright light of progress, but the shadow of endurance. No longer display, but persistence. Victoria did not need to appear in order to be present. Her absence itself became a message that there are values that are not negotiable, even when the world insists that you move on. In the early years of widowhood, Victoria remained at Windsor, Balmoral, Osborne, spaces that allowed her to breathe. She wrote. She reread old letters. She walked slowly through the gardens. She allowed grief to settle without rushing to heal. And in that stillness, her power, paradoxically, became more durable, for the public saw in her not perfection, but humanity. Some empires endure through victory. From 1861 onward, the Victorian reign endured through the endurance of a single heart. But grief, if left without contact, can close a person off for too long. And history, never cruel, yet always practical, brought into Victoria's life a rough hand, a voice without ceremony, a presence without polish, enough to draw her out of the deepest darkness without betraying memory. In the next part, we will meet John Brown, a man from the Highlands, who came not as a statesman, not as a healer, but as someone who dared to speak plainly. There, amid mountain winds and cold earth, grief would not disappear, but it would learn how to breathe. And when grief learns to breathe, power transforms from endurance into continuation. There are pains that cannot be healed by advice. They soften only when we encounter someone who is not afraid to look straight into that pain and still remain. After 1861, Victoria lived as though time itself had changed substance. Every day began in the black of mourning clothes. Every room carried an emptiness. Chairs, pens, papers that once moved in pairs now moved alone, and that single rhythm, though still steady, resembled the ticking of a clock in an empty church, on time but cold. In such an atmosphere, the palace became a place both safe and suffocating. Everyone spoke softly. Everyone tread carefully. Everyone tried to preserve decorum. But decorum, when grief grows too large, can become a tight wrapping, making it hard to breathe. And then from a very different place, a very different man entered, John Brown. He was a Scottish servant at Balmoral in the Highlands, a land of strong winds, cold rain, and hills as solemn as history itself. Brown bore none of the bearing of a courtier, no polished speech, no instinct for pouring flattery into the ears of power. He arrived with something rare within palace walls, raw honesty, and that very roughness became the remedy. Brown did not see Victoria as a symbol. He saw her as a woman worn down by grief. When she withdrew into pain, he did not come to explain or console with words, but to pull her outward, into the wind, onto the earth, into the life that was still moving. He urged her to ride, to walk, to breathe the air of the Highlands until it stung her face. He dared to say what no one else dared to say. What are you doing? Not to offend, but to awaken. In a world governed by protocol, addressing the Queen as woman bordered on sacrilege. But for Victoria, it was liberation. A small moment in which she no longer had to brace herself as an institution. She was allowed to return to the simplest state, a human being. If you are listening at night, imagine a tranquil scene. Mist settling over pine forests, the wind stretching like a long breath, and a woman dressed in black stepping outside, walking slowly over damp ground. Beside her is a rough man, moving silently at her side. He does not speak much, but his steps are firm. In that firmness, grief does not disappear, but it is supported. John Brown brought Victoria a form of comfort that did not come from reason, but from the body. Go outside. Stand up. Let the wind wake you. Some losses cut too deep for the mind to heal. Only nature, earth, wind, rain can remind a person that they are still alive. The court disliked Brown. They found him too close, too familiar, too out of place. Whispers gathered like dust in the light. But Victoria did not allow that to decide matters. Grief had taught her a lesson. The opinions of others change with the seasons. The truth of the heart does not negotiate. She protected Brown, not only out of gratitude, but because she valued the rarity of a relationship not built on power. In the palace, everyone knew how to behave toward the Queen. Only Brown dared to behave toward her as someone who was hurting, and that, though it sounds simple, was extraordinarily rare. Within that comfort, something important happened. Victoria began to reconnect with the real world. Not the world of reports and decrees, but the world of laboring people, of blunt speech, of outdoor air. Brown, through his plainness, pulled her back from the risk of becoming a stone monument to sorrow. Victoria's grief, once an institution, gradually became a condition she could live with. She still wore black, still preserved Albert's rooms, still remembered. But moments of softness began to appear. Moments when her face showed not only endurance, but the trace of a brief, rare, genuine smile. For older listeners, this story often resonates deeply, for everyone has known loss and has understood that what saves us is sometimes not advice or philosophy, but someone who dares to say, "Come on," someone who walks beside us in silence so that we do not have to walk alone. But Victoria's return could not rest on emotion alone. Sooner or later, power would call her back to the center, not for ceremony, but because the country needed a stabilizing axis. And when she returned, she would face the most extraordinary political minds of the age, men of both vision and ambition, Gladstone and Disraeli. In the next part, we will enter the world of politics, where words can cut like knives, where romance can become strategy, and where Victoria will reveal something profoundly human. She ruled not only through power, but through emotion, carefully choosing whom to trust. But hold on to the image of the Highlands, a land of cold wind and a rough man who helped a queen relearn how to breathe. There is a gentle truth we often forget. Power does not reside only in laws, but also in the way people speak to one another. After years wrapped in mourning, after the Highlands and the cold winds that taught her heart how to breathe again, Victoria gradually returned to the center of political life. She did not return as a victor. She returned as someone who had learned that some pains never disappear. Yet there is still work that must be done. And it was in this period that her reign revealed a distinctive trait. The power of a queen within an increasingly democratized system was no longer absolute command, but subtle influence. An influence shaped by relationships, by trust, and by psychology. Two men entered this world like opposing currents of air. William Ewart Gladstone and Benjamin Disraeli. One resembled a long sermon, correct, rigorous, yet cold. The other resembled a drama with a musical score, smooth, alluring, and deliberate. And Victoria, with the keen intuition of someone who had once been controlled, immediately sensed the difference, not in policy, but in how each man positioned her. Gladstone spoke to Victoria as though she were at a public meeting. He brought sharp arguments, long sentences, chains of reasoning stacked like staircases without landings. He did not try to make her feel valued. He wanted to make her agree, and for a woman who had reclaimed her autonomy on the very day she ascended the throne, the feeling of being lectured rather than engaged in dialogue was deeply uncomfortable. Not because Victoria disliked intellect. She respected intellect, but she could not tolerate being treated as a platform from which others delivered speeches. Her power, though constitutionally limited, was still the power of dignity, and Gladstone, for all his greatness, often made her feel that dignity had been pushed aside. Disraeli was the opposite. He entered the room with the refinement of someone who understood that, to persuade a queen, one must first make her feel seen. Disraeli did not speak at length to prove he was right. He said just enough to make Victoria want to listen further. He told stories. He used imagery. He knew how to turn politics, so often dry, into something rhythmic, luminous. He called her the fairy. It sounded like flattery, but it was flattery with technique. It did not diminish. It elevated. It drew Victoria out of the black of mourning, out of the image of a sorrowful widow, and placed her back at the center of a symbolic narrative. In an age when the monarchy needed public confidence, Disraeli understood that symbolism was not incidental. It was a spiritual foundation. If you are listening at night, notice a very human lesson. The same truth, spoken in a different tone, produces a different outcome. Gladstone spoke truth through reason. Disraeli spoke truth through regulated emotion. And Victoria, guided by intuition, responded with trust. This relationship was not merely personal affection. It carried clear political consequences. Disraeli, through his finesse, helped draw Victoria back into the center of her reign after many years of withdrawal. He did not force her to appear. He made her want to appear. And when someone in power wants to act, that action is far more durable than when it is compelled. The height of this bond came in 1877, when Disraeli pushed Parliament to grant Victoria the title Empress of India. This title was more than a name. It was a reframing of the reign. From queen of an island nation, Victoria became the symbol of a vast empire. For Victoria, who had long viewed the red map as a network of responsibility and order, the title touched something profound. Imperial pride, quiet but powerful. Here the psychology of power is revealed clearly. Victoria was not persuaded by logic alone. She was persuaded by logic wrapped in respect. Disraeli gave her the sense that she was not merely part of an institution, but its soul. And when an aging person, especially one who has endured loss, feels that they still matter, they gain the strength to continue. Gladstone, though not beloved by Victoria, was no less important. The very contrast between these two men completes the portrait of the Victorian era. On one side, the sternness of reform, on the other, the romance of symbolism. And Victoria, standing between them, demonstrated a rare quality of a modern monarch. She knew she could no longer rule by absolute power, yet she could still influence. By choosing whom she trusted, choosing the tone she answered with, choosing the rhythm of her presence before the public. If you have reached this point, let the pacing slow, for this is the most delicate layer of power. Not clear victories or defeats, but psychology. We often think politics is decided in Parliament, but sometimes history is shaped in a quiet room, when a queen feels either heard or dismissed. And as Victoria gradually reclaimed her central position, as mourning ceased to be an absolute wall, her spirit, in the final years of life, opened in an unexpected direction, not toward Europe, not toward Parliament, but toward the east. A small doorway leading to new languages, the scent of spices, and another controversial bond, the Munshi. In the next part, we will meet Abdul Karim, the man who taught Victoria Urdu, and encounter a very late, very human Victoria, an elderly queen still capable of curiosity, still capable of learning, and still capable of defending a relationship, simply because she believed in the value of a human being. But before we turn eastward, hold on to this. Power sometimes lies not in who is right, but in who knows how to speak in the right way. There is something curious about old age. The closer one comes to the end, the less one needs to prove, and the easier it becomes to be true. After the long years of mourning, after the delicate encounters with prime ministers, Victoria entered her later years with a different kind of power, the power of endurance. She no longer needed to appear in order to be acknowledged. She simply needed to exist, like the steady heartbeat of an entire empire. Yet even a steady heartbeat sometimes longs for something new, not to overturn everything, but to breathe more fully. And in the final years of her life, that newness came to Victoria from a direction the court did not expect, the East. In 1887, on the occasion of the grand celebrations marking 50 years of her reign, the court received delegations from across the empire. Among them was a young man from India, Abdul Karim. At first, he was merely an attendant in the entourage, a small name on a long list, a face easily forgotten once the ceremonies ended. But for Victoria, who had lived long enough to know that destiny sometimes enters without noise, Abdul Karim did not pass like the wind. She called him the Munshi, the teacher. From that moment, a window opened, not in the stone walls of the palace, but in the mind of an aging queen. That window led to a world she had long ruled on paper, through reports, through red-colored maps, but had never truly touched through language, through scent, through the rhythm of daily life. Victoria began to learn Urdu. Imagine the scene: a quiet morning, pale light falling upon the table, her hands no longer as quick as they once were, yet still holding the pen with the concentration of a child learning to write. The curved strokes of Urdu appeared on the page like small waves. She practiced each phrase. She asked for meanings. She corrected mistakes, not to embellish her record, but to expand her inner world. In your outline, there are deeply personal lines. Victoria wrote sentences such as, "I will miss the Munshi very much," words filled with emotion, told in the DSP voice, "We need not present them as a scandal. We need only emphasize what lies at the core." In her later years, Victoria found in the Munshi not merely a servant, but a bridge, linking her to another world, one she had once viewed from a distance through power, and now approached through curiosity and human feeling. The court could not accept this. They were not troubled only by the Munshi's favor. They were troubled because he revealed an uncomfortable truth. The empire was not only a system, it was made of people. And within the racial hierarchies of the age, a queen defending an Indian man as a gentleman disrupted an invisible order. But Victoria, who had once been confined by the Kensington system, who had once been expected to have even her breathing controlled, had a clear instinct. She detested being told whom she must be close to and whom she must keep away from. She defended the Munshi, at times fiercely, as though she were protecting not only a person, but the right to choose in the final years of her life. If you are listening at night, notice this gentle truth. Many older people do not need more power. They need respect. And in this relationship, Victoria did not only grant respect, she sought it in her own way. The Munshi, by occupying the role of teacher, placed Victoria in the position of a learner. In that position, she did not have to bear a crown. She only had to open herself. Through the Munshi, the East was no longer merely a red patch on a map. It became the scent of spices, stories of customs, of different rituals, of values that an empire could not administer through paperwork. Victoria began to see India as a culture with its own depth, not merely as a territory to be exploited or ruled. This is a subtle point in the outline. It reveals an older Victoria who was more open, more humane, and in some measure, beyond the prejudices of her own age. Of course, history does not become simple because of this. The relationship was controversial. It stirred undercurrents within the palace. It exposed a rift between a queen who had lived long enough to desire inner freedom and a court determined to preserve the proper image. DSP need not take sides. DSP needs only to hold the question gently. Why did an aging queen need such a window? Perhaps because after passing through enough mourning, a person comes to understand that what matters most is not reputation, but the feeling of being alive. Learning a new language, defending a despised individual, seeing the world from a different angle, these were Victoria's ways of reminding herself that she was not only a symbol of an era, but still a beating heart. And then, as with all final chapters of a life, that window slowly closed with time. But before it closed, it left behind something enduring. The image of an elderly queen, still curious, still learning, and still capable of doing what power so rarely does, recognizing the value of someone unlike herself. In the next part, we will step out of these inner corridors and into a radiant public day. The Diamond Jubilee of 1897, when London was once again filled with flags, when the procession flowed like a river, and when Victoria, frail yet enduring, saw the entire empire gather around her as a final salute to the century. But before the cheers, hold on to this tranquil image. An elderly woman, pen in hand, writing lines of Urdu, adding one small thread of light to the closing pages of her life. There are sunsets that do not signal an ending. They gather the light of an entire long day, then release it one last time, slowly, so that everyone may see where they have been. On June 22nd, 1897, London awoke to an unusual atmosphere. Not hurried excitement, but a deep collective pause, as though the whole city inhaled together, then held its breath. 60 years of reign. 60 years since that misty morning in 1837, when a young girl descended the staircase in her nightgown and heard the words, "Your Majesty." Now that girl was an elderly woman, her body weary, her hands gently trembling, her movements reliant on a wheelchair. Yet in her eyes the gaze remained, not as sharp as before, but deeper. It was the look of someone who had lived long enough to no longer need to prove anything. The Diamond Jubilee unfolded like a river. The procession stretched 6 miles, flowing through familiar streets, now blanketed in flags and flowers. The sound was no longer of individual footsteps, but a harmony of millions. Londoners stood beside soldiers from the colonies. Unfamiliar uniforms mingled with different skin tones and accents, all converging into a single rhythm. Victoria sat in her carriage, slow and silent. She did not rise. She did not wave excessively. She did not deliver a speech. Her strength no longer allowed it, but her presence alone The mere fact that she was there created a peculiar field of gravity. People cheered not for a specific act, but for the endurance of a single life carried through a turbulent current of time. If you are listening in the night, notice this feeling. Some moments move us not because of climax, but because of duration. 60 years, long enough for a generation to be born and grow old, long enough for the world to shift from candles to electricity, from horse-drawn carriages to trains, from handwritten letters to telegraphs. And amid all those changes, one person remained, like a marker against which others measured distance. Victoria watched the procession, and perhaps in an intensely private instant, she saw her entire life. The young faces that once greeted her at her accession were gone. Those who had walked beside her, father, mother, Albert, had all departed. In their place stood new generations, new lands, new cheers. The empire, like a living organism, had shed and renewed itself, and she, strangely, remained the slow-beating heart at its center. That day, Victoria sent out a brief message, without flourish, without oratory. From my heart I thank my beloved people. May God bless them all. The words were simple, and it was precisely that simplicity that allowed them to endure. After 60 years, she needed no grand statements. She said only what had carried her the entire way: gratitude. The Diamond Jubilee was a rare moment when military power, economic strength, and public affection reached their peak together. But DSP need not linger on the surface. What is more, worth hearing, is the inner silence. Amid the cheers, Victoria still carried mourning within her. She was still the widow of Windsor. She still preserved the unchanged rooms. She still lived with memory. And it was precisely this coexistence between splendor and loss that made that day more human, more profound. Some leaders are remembered for victories. Victoria is remembered for endurance. The Diamond Jubilee did not merely honor an era, it honored the capacity to stand firm across time. In a world that moved ever faster, standing firm became an achievement. When the procession ended, when the flags were lowered, London gradually returned to its everyday rhythm, but the resonance lingered long after. People spoke of that day as they would of a beautiful afternoon, not dazzling, but warm. An afternoon that made clear some forms of power do not continue through new actions, but through meaning accumulated over time. After that day, Victoria appeared less frequently in public. Her body weakened, journeys grew shorter, audiences became rarer. Yet no one felt her absence, for her image, frail, silent, yet beloved, had been etched into collective memory as a quiet full stop at the end of a century. And as that radiant twilight slowly faded, history prepared for a long night, not dark, but calm, a night for summation, a night to ask again, what remains when the lights go out, when the crowds disperse, when a century closes? In the next and final part, we will step into the enduring legacy, not through monuments, not through slogans, but through small objects in a coffin, through a funeral that chose the color white, and through the gentle sense that an era was preserved whole. By a woman who knew how to stand still long enough for the world to pass through her. Let the rhythm slow now, for after the sunset, the most precious thing left behind is quiet. When a story reaches its final passage, history no longer needs to speak loudly. It lowers its voice, it slows down, and it stops searching for a neat conclusion, because there are lives that do not end with applause, but with endurance. On January 22nd, 1901, at Osborne House by the quiet sea, Victoria breathed her last. There was no dramatic tragedy, no lengthy final testament, only a cold morning, a light wind, and a century standing quietly outside the door. The woman who had sat on the throne for 63 years, longer than any British monarch before her, departed as she had lived in her later years, quietly. Her funeral was arranged according to a choice that surprised many. White, not the black of sorrow, but the white of hope. In her coffin, by her own private wish, she carried small keepsakes: Albert's dressing gown, an old photograph, a ring, not a crown, not medals. These objects spoke for the core truth of Victoria's life. Power may operate outwardly, but meaning often resides in what is closest to the heart. She was laid to rest beside Albert at Frogmore, ending 40 years of waiting for reunion. And at that moment, an era closed. People would call it by a simple name, the Victorian era. Not because she conquered the most territory, but because under her reign the world changed its rhythm, from horse-drawn carriages to trains, from candles to electricity, from handwritten letters to telegraphs. And amid those transformations, one person stood firm, long enough to become a standard. Victoria's legacy cannot be contained in a list of achievements. It exists in the bricks of railway stations, in the steady rhythms of factory work, in the idea of family as a moral center, in how society understands duty and devotion. She did not impose these standards by decree. She modeled them, and a society in need of stability amid industrial speed learned by watching. There is a subtle truth here. Victoria did not rule like an epic hero. She ruled like a good habit, repeated long enough to become durable. She accepted the limits of constitutional power, yet did not relinquish influence. She understood that in a complex world, profound influence often comes from reliability, not from intensity. For older listeners, this story touches a familiar experience. We do not have to change everything through dazzling moments. Sometimes, what shapes a life is measured perseverance, showing up on time, keeping promises, and continuing even after motivation has faded. Victoria lived this way. Even in mourning, she preserved order. Even in withdrawal, she remained present. Even in silence, she exerted influence. If we look back across the entire journey, from the dining room at Kensington, through constraint and control, through the promise, "I will be good," through quiet partnership, family, industry, empire, loss, and late opening doors, we can see a calm red thread running through it all: the ethics of responsibility. Not glamorous, not easy, but strong enough to keep a rapidly accelerating world from slipping off course. And that is why this era bears the name of a woman. Not because she was perfect, but because she was consistent. Consistent in valuing family, consistent in work discipline, consistent in loyalty, consistent in the belief that progress must be governed and power must be humanized. As the 20th century opened, with new promises and new storms, Victoria's legacy did not vanish. It transformed. It became custom, standard, and the quiet assurance that society may change very fast. Yet the ethics of endurance still have a place. And as long as that place remains, ordinary people can still learn how to stand steady amid upheaval. Now, as the story reaches its quiet point, let your breathing slow. Remember that not everyone needs to become a symbol to leave a mark. Sometimes the mark comes from staying with duty, staying with those one loves, staying with the values one has chosen, until time itself offers its thanks. If you are listening to Deep Sleep of Power at night, let these images settle like gentle waves. There is no need for a hurried conclusion. Simply feel a calm truth. There are lives that have kept an entire era from breaking. And in that silence, sleep arrives, deep, slow, and peaceful. Wishing you a quiet night. Sleep well.